You are at Lake Rant, where I rant about whatever my $15 a month plus patrons want me to rant about. You can get one of these by being one of those. This one's from Nico Randell, who says, rant about your favorite and least favorite fantasy races and character classes. If you want, you can also talk about the reasons for racial stereotypes. Orcs are evil, dwarfs are drunks, elves are good with bows, and why elves are so common. For example, both World of Warcraft and Elder Scrolls have many playable elf races, and there are also many races of corrupted evil elves. Well, I mean, the popularity of these is pretty much attributable to, I think, a combination of J.R.R. Tolkien and Dungeons and Dragons. Like, I think that, so many people were so directly influenced by just whatever fantasy they grew up with or D&D campaigns that that is their mental image of a fantasy world. It's like, you have this idea of, like, fantasy, what fantasy can mean, but it's like, I guess it's similar to cyberpunk, right? Like, you can make the argument that something like Technolize is a cyberpunk series, but it doesn't really look like cyberpunk, so you wouldn't immediately jump to that, even though, like, in terms of what it's about, it is similar to it. It's just that, like, people have put that genre in a box because they just like that particular aesthetic and they just want to make stories like that rather than try to, like, expand on the themes of the genre. So I think that fantasy is much the same way. It's like, yeah, I could write a fantasy that doesn't have elves, but I like elves. I grew up with elves. I want to make a story about elves. So I think that's why they're so they're so all over the place. And, like, I think those games, like the idea of, like, dark elves, for instance, like, somebody comes up with it, everybody else is like, oh, that's a great idea. Like, it just kind of at some point entered the public consciousness idea of elves. I like elves because they got the pointy ears. They tend to be sexy, pointy-eared blonde chicks with nice long legs. Yeah, elves are pretty hot. I would say that also, like, Hylians and Kokiri, based on elves, are also cool. Like, if we're talking broadening the fantasy stuff. But, because, all the ones in Zelda are just based on the same things. I mean, the Zoras are elves. I guess Zoras and Hylians are kind of elves, and Kokiris are, like, fairy elf fucking hobbits. It's strange, but, I think, I've never been a huge fan of orcs. If I'm going by, like, the WoW races, let's say, like, dwarves, I think are fun because I like what they're into, but, like, aesthetically I don't resonate with them that much. I would say, like, elves are cool when they're sexy. Guy elves are not interesting at all. Fucking dark elves are fine, I guess, if you just want to fuck a purple chick, which I do. Let's see. Fucking, yeah, orcs, goblins, all that kind of stuff. Goblins are probably the most boring to me. Like, I don't understand why you'd ever want to write a story about goblins. Goblins suck. They're boring and stupid. They're just small guys. They're just cannon fodder. Yeah, I guess I love undead. Like, I guess, like, necromancers and undead are, like, my favorite of the, like, classes and enemies. Mages can be cool if they're really out there, but, like, generic fireball shooting mage, not interesting at all. Except Megumin, because that's the joke. Gods are usually cool. I'm a fan of gods, mini gods. Like, what are some of the other words for that? Demigods, stuff like that. That stuff's cool. But yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of the generic fantasy kind of style. Like, I'm not generally big into, like, that stuff. I like the Lord of the Rings just fine, but, like, if you told me, if, like, I was gonna create a fantasy world, I definitely would not include any of that stuff in it. Like, it just would not be interesting to me. So yeah, I would say that I don't have any particular strong favorites. My least favorites are probably just the generic enemy types. Again, stuff like goblins. But, like, otherwise, I'm pretty indifferent towards fantasy stuff.